and get us started. Welcome to the Texas Children in Nature Network webinar, Green Schoolyards as a Climate Change and Health Solution. My name is Sarah Coles, and I'm the Executive Director of the Texas Children in Nature Network. We are excited to have you with us today. We are recording our session today, so thank you for joining us. To save bandwidth for all of our attendees and for a clean recording, we ask everyone to turn off their cameras and mute themselves during the presentation. I will be monitoring the chat, so you can share any of your questions there, and I'll share them with the presenters. Beth and Sonia are running tech for us today. Thank you so much, both Beth and Sonia. We are recording today's session. Alice will share a follow-up email, the recording link, in a few days. If you're uncomfortable with your name showing on the recording, you can change your name to anonymous and then private message Beth with your name for our attendance. Also, if your Zoom name doesn't match the name you registered with, please change your name or let Beth know. If you're in need of a certificate and we do not have your name on the attendance list here, you will not be able to provide you with a certificate. And just a reminder, if you are needing a certificate, you will need to use the email provided in the Zoom link email at the end of the workshop and let them know that you need a certificate. I'm going to go ahead and do our land acknowledgement. Texas Children in Nature Network is headquartered in Austin, and as such, I'm on the ancestral and unceded land of the Tonkawa, Comanche, and Sana people. Our ongoing colonial presence on Indigenous lands compels us to take action to counteract the effects of colonization. The work we do through the Texas Children in Nature Network is one small step towards that effort. I'm going to put a few links in the chat about land acknowledgements and about those people groups in just a moment. But I'd like to go ahead and welcome our speakers today. Melody Alcazar is with the City of Austin, and Kellen Lanza is with the UT School of Public Health. They have both been working with the city's Connecting Children to Nature initiative in Austin to engage more schools around green schoolyards. Thank you for joining us today, and I'm going to let y'all take over.
Thank you, Sarah. I can share my screen now with the PowerPoint for Melody and myself. Let's see. Okay, do you see the screen? Okay, nodding from Melody. All right.
All right. Yeah, I can kick us off. Thank you so much, Sarah, for that introduction. We're really glad to be here in this virtual space. I think that we have spoken on this topic in person at the last Texas Children in Nature Network conference, or I guess 2 years ago, on some initial results. So we're really excited to finally share out, how all of this has come together and how it could potentially impact you in your own kind of green schoolyard space. So I am Melody Alcazar, and like Sarah mentioned, I am with the City of Austin. I manage the city's Connecting Children to Nature initiative for the city, and I'm housed in our Parks and Rec department in our planning division. Kevin?
Sure, and I'm Kevin Lanza. I'm an assistant professor at UTHealth, School of Public Health in Austin, Texas. And I was lucky enough to meet up with Melody back in 2019, and we developed a project idea, and it turned into this. So we collected these data from 2019 to 2020, with having all our full results in store by 2021. I can move us on to the next slide. Does that work, Melody?
Yeah, that sounds good. Before we dive into kind of the nitty-gritty on our actual project, I wanted to provide some context just so you understand kind of the landscape in which we're working and how we were able to approach a project of this scale. So like I mentioned, I manage CCCN, and if you're not familiar, hopefully you will be soon if you haven't heard of it, but CCCN is a partnership between the National League of Cities and the Children in Nature Network, and they use nature as a framework for racial equity. So Austin was one of the pilot sites. This map, I think, is slightly out of date now. There are probably over 50 cities that are participating in this national effort. But we started back in 2016, and part of those early efforts involved things like mapping out areas of Austin that we saw to be nature deficient. We passed a Children's Outdoor Bill of Rights, and we basically had to decide, like, how are we as a city? And I use city, both capital C, like actual, city departments, but also all of the partners that are involved in, children's everyday life. So the school district, our university partners, all of our many nonprofits that we have here in Austin. So pulling everyone together and coming up with an implementation plan that says, this is how we as a city collectively are going to approach this effort and how we hope to achieve some of our goals of better connecting children to nature. You can go to the next slide, Kevin. We have currently 5 strategies that we are approaching this effort with. Green School Parks, which is our primary focus today, is where we started. And so really due to the amount of time that children spend in school, it provides us with a huge, I think, impact in terms of where kids are spending their time. Our specific strategies run every age and stage of a child's life as they're in Austin. Our Green School Park strategy focuses primarily on that school day. In Austin, a majority of our schools are actually pre-K through 12. However, a lot of schools that are across Texas and across the US often start at kinder. So you'll see kind of both ages. We don't necessarily in this particular project did not do anything with that kind of pre-K group. We actually have a whole nother strategy that focuses on the youngers. But just to give you an idea on how our school system is set up. You can see kind of the landscape of our Green School Park efforts within our city. You can see mostly, again, I'm housed in the Parks Department, so lots of PARD people are joining on in this effort. But we also work very closely with our Watershed Protection Department. A large swath of space in Austin is watershed land. And so we engage very heavily with them on those properties. Within the school system, we are working primarily within academics and also within operations and maintenance. If you've done anything related to green schoolyards, you know you need both of those folks on board in order to make programs like this really successful. There is a little dash line that goes from our parks to our schools, and that's because in Austin, we have a joint use agreement that covers 21 sites. So those are areas of land that are both co-owned and co-managed by both the Parks Department and the City of Austin. So in terms of this larger strategy, that's where we were able to really step in and say, okay, we have ownership over this land, so we can much easier make some changes in this space. So when we started to look at pilot sites and where we might focus our efforts, we really looked at these joint use sites because it's just much easier for us to go into those areas. Next slide. So I think we look at how kind of we have approached this work in just a minute, but in terms of, how we've actually defined this, we didn't do that until probably 2 or 3 years into our Green Schoolyards effort. And that was a big shift for us. Initially, again, we were just focused on those joint use sites. Once we started to put pen to paper and really define what we meant by Green Schoolyard versus Green School Park, we started to open up funding opportunities. It was much easier to explain kind of what we were doing and who we really needed to talk to. So that was a great switch for us. You'll see all sorts of definitions throughout the country on what people mean by green schoolyards and green school parks. From the Austin perspective, you can see the definition here. So it's a school ground that includes both an outdoor classroom, some sort of garden, so that can be habitat or vegetable, rainwater collection, that's really any kind of green stormwater infrastructure, and 4 other eco features. And those really run the gamut. We have schools that have chickens, we have schools that have bees, there's nature trails, there's nature play. So lots of ways that this green infrastructure is showing up on our campuses. In order to be a designated green schoolyard, you have to meet all of these criteria, so have all of those features that we require, but you also have to use those for learning purposes. And this can be as complicated as like actually taking lessons out into the garden, doing measurements and using it in kind of that traditional sense. But it's also things like bringing reading out under the trees or having lunch at the picnic tables. So all of the different ways that a campus can kind of use that outdoor space, we want to see in a designated green schoolyard. If you go to the next slide, you'll see some examples of how this shows up in Austin. There in the middle, you can see an example of what some of the features look like. So that's a great pond. Down on the bottom, on the left-hand side of my screen, at least, you can see kiddos jumping on a nature play installation. On the opposite side of that, on the bottom, you can see kids taking reading out in that outdoor space. So those are movable stumps that kiddos use. And then at the top, some more program specific activities. So that's where we have a lot of partners that work in the space. So partners coming into that campus, working directly with classes hands-on, taking lessons out into that garden. And you can see some examples of how those programs are conducted on school grounds. Looking at, taking it one step further. So in order to become an official Green School Park, you have to have all of the things to be a green schoolyard, but then you also have to open up your campus to be accessible to the public during that out of school time. So again, being a joint use site, that's much easier because you have to be per the agreement. But when we took away the requirement of being joint use and just said, if you as a campus, as a principal, and in Austin, principals have a lot of say over what happens. But if that principal makes the decision to say, you know what, I want this to be a community space, a community hub, we see the value in that, and they make that decision and take that step, even if they're not joint use, they can shift into becoming a green school park. And on the next slide, you'll see some great examples of how this shows up in space. All different ways that people are using these areas during that out of school time. So at the top, on the left-hand side, you can see people with lots of trash bags. So we work very closely with a group in town called Austin Parks Foundation, and they lead basically lots of cleanup events, things like that, different ways to steward those park spaces. Because of all the eco features that we now see on campuses, that stewardship piece is really important to engage community around and make sure that we've got involvement and buy-in from them. In terms of other types of infrastructure that we install, generally temporary, there's a great example of a story walk. So something like that meets both campus goals of literacy, but also community goals of using that space, encouraging use of that track, folks that kind of go around on a bicycle or on a walking path. So trying to meet both, again, school goals as well as community goals. On the bottom, probably lots of soccer, other types of sports that you can see in engaging with the public in those spaces. Sometimes there's things like movies in the park, so they can be really big events or small events, like partnering here on the bottom with our Chisalo Cycling Initiative. You can see some kids learning how to ride bicycles for the first time at their school park. Next slide. All right, so in terms of how we have been approaching this effort, for our pilots, and I will just caveat to say that we are not doing this model moving forward, and part of that comes with that definition change that we implemented. But with our 3 pilots, and we have 3 that have been implemented to date, we did a very traditional model of engaging with the community, lots of engagement. So, principal coffees and block walking and all sorts of surveys and design charrettes, and taking all of that, creating a design and finding funding to do that installation. So it's usually these like full campus installs, not feature by feature. Once everything goes in, then we're shifting to look at how do we engage our partners in this space? How do we make teachers comfortable? How do we get community to come and steward the new features that are there? So the activation element. So if you have a green schoolyard strategy in your own community, you likely have followed a model very similar to this in terms of a lot of those pilot sites that get installed. So I say all of this as a framework to say, we had pilot sites. We knew we had a lot of infrastructure going in. They were providing ecosystem services, and that is awesome. And what else? Are we actually being successful? What is the point of our Green School Park program? Are we meeting those goals? We didn't really have a way to answer that. Not the best way to approach a problem, which is coming up with a solution and not knowing if you're measuring it. But that's just the way that it rolled out. And so we had a grant opportunity come along that provided kind of a means to that end for us to find out if we were actually meeting our goals, if there was a measurable change to the infrastructure that went in and the impact that it potentially had on both that school and community. And that's when we reached out to Kevin. So I'll turn it over to him to walk us through our project.
All right. Thank you so much, Melody, for that table setting with all these definitions specific to Austin, the green school parks, the green schoolyards, where all green school parks are green schoolyards, but not all green schoolyards are green school parks, because a green school park has that extra layer of being open to the community outside of school hours. And so now we'll pivot, as Melody mentioned, to kind of to what was the impetus for conducting a research project on these different green spaces at schools. And so here are some data from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which shows that Central Texas, like across the world, like other warm climates across the world, is currently hot, but it's getting warmer. And here are some data from Travis County, the county that Austin finds itself in, where it shows the number of days that are extreme heat days or above 95 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's from current time all the way through the end of the century. And this is shown under two different greenhouse gas emission scenarios: an intermediate emission scenarios, where across the world, we have a continued increase in greenhouse gas emissions until about the year 2040, at which point policy leads to a significant decline in greenhouse gases. Then we have a high emission scenario shown by the red line, and this is where emissions continue being unchecked by policy across the world through the end of the century. And what you can see here is that under both scenarios, there's about 75 days a year considered extreme heat days in Austin. But as you move to the end of the century, that more or less increases by, let's see, the red line or the yellow line, the intermediate scenario, by about, 30 or so days. And then the red line shows it's significantly more days, about 150 per year. And so depending on how much we emit across the world. And so as we're getting warmer, we're also noting that this climate change is leading to impacts on human health. Here's a conceptual framework by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And in the inner ring, we see the major climate change impacts, including rising temperatures. And in the middle ring, we see how these different climate change impacts influence exposures, such as extreme heat. And on the outer portion, we see how these different exposures influence public health. This work, or typically work in extreme heat and health, has focused on heat-related mortality, yet what's missing and understudied is how extreme heat affects health behaviors, such as physical activity. And if extreme heat is serving as a barrier to engaging in physical activity because of people's thermal discomfort. And so that's kind of one of the portions we're interested in looking at today. And the reason we're looking into that is because children in Texas, as is the case with other places across the US, are not reaching sufficient levels of physical activity, and there are differences that exist by race, ethnicity. So here are some data for Texas fourth graders across Texas, collected by the Michael and Susan Dell Center for Healthy Living in Austin. And what it shows is the percentage of fourth graders meeting the National Physical Activity Guidelines. We can see across the main race ethnicities of Texas that the majority of children are not reaching physical activity guidelines for health and well-being, yet Black and Latino children are less likely than white children and those who aren't within these three main race ethnicity categories of Texas. So this begs the question, is our warm climate, which is only expected to get warmer, is that going to serve as a barrier to children being active into the future? And so that led to this Green Schoolyards project, where we had the specific aims of determining how green features, specifically trees, gardens, and nature trails at joint use school parks in Austin, impacted ambient temperatures within parks, the physical activity levels of Latino children from economically disadvantaged households, and how these children's connection to nature related to their social emotional learning skills. Here are some photos from the data collection at the Green School Parks that we were collecting data from. What you can see in both of these photos are children at a park, and they're under the shade. What you can't see in both of these photos is that it was over 100 degrees Fahrenheit when they were taken. So this project, Green Schoolyards project, took place at 3 joint use school parks in Austin, each of which were green school parks in that they were open, that they were joint use and they had the features of a green schoolyard. And we specifically focus on those schools that were located in communities with low nature access, as defined by the city of Austin, in terms of physical access to quality nature. And they were also schools serving majority economically disadvantaged Latino households, so over 85% at each of the 3 schools. We conducted data collection during 2 weeks in September and 1 week in November each year in both 2019 and 2020. We chose September because it's a historically high temperature month during the school year, in November for comparison purposes. And we measured those trees, gardens, and nature trails by drawing polygons of each of them using high resolution aerial imagery provided by the US Department of Agriculture within a geographic information system. And then in each of the 3 school parks, we measured air temperature and relative humidity by installing 10 weather stations. And there's an image of one of those. And we set them to collect data every 5 minutes during the study weeks. Here's one of the 3 school parks. We call this the intervention park, which had received over 100 tree saplings, as well as a few other green features about a year before the project started. And what you can see is the siting of the 10 weather stations that collected the air temperature and relative humidity across the park. We aimed for an even spatial distribution and also capturing different land covers, such as grass, mulch, and pavement, as well as land use, such as a basketball court or playground. Note that we didn't put sensors in places that would affect the use of those spaces, such as in the middle of the soccer field. The Green Schoolyards project actually consists of 2 separate studies. The first is a cross-sectional study that focuses on the physical sites within the parks themselves. And the second is a cohort study, which focuses on students we specifically enrolled for the project. So first, with that cross-sectional study, we split each of the 3 parks into what are called target areas. And on the right-hand side, you see about 21 target areas for this given park that we split it up into. And the splitting is based on the use of those different spaces within the school park. So you can see number 5 is the soccer field versus number 9 is one of the playground structures. And then for each of those target areas, we used an instrument called SOPARK, which stands for the System for Observing Play and Recreation in Communities. This is where us as data collectors went out to the parks 4 times per day during the study period and visually scanned with our eyes left to right for each target area and recorded what we saw. And parts of what we were interested in recording were the outcomes listed here: the physical activity levels of children that were using the spaces, how they interacted with green features, if at all. So that would be under a tree canopy or touching a tree, using a nature trail, or using a garden. And then because our study took place in 2019 and 2020, we overlapped the COVID-19 pandemic in the second year. And that's where we added 2 other features of interest to measure. That was whether children maintained social distancing and whether or not they wore masks while at the parks. So that was the physical site study, the cross-sectional study. And now we're moving to the cohort study within the Green Schoolyards project. This is where we enrolled about 70 children per school, 35 third graders, 35 fourth graders, totaling about 213 students. And we tasked these students within their 20-minute on average recess period during the study weeks with wearing an elastic belt that had 2 devices on it: an accelerometer, that red device here, that measures physical activity levels, and that black device, a GPS unit, which measures their geographic location in time and space. So by having children wear both of these during recess, we were able to see where they were moving and how active they were at those spots. With that same cohort of 213 children, we also measured their psychological connection to nature, and then we wanted to see how that associated with their social emotional learning skills, with the hypothesis being those who are more connected to nature may have improved social emotional learning skills for the benefits of nature. And so we measured connection to nature through an instrument called the Connection to Nature Index. This is a composite index where you average the responses across the 16 different questions or items asked in the survey. Here's an example of one of the items on a 5-point Likert scale, from a sad face to a smiley face. Then we measured children's social emotional learning skills by a student survey already administered by the school district, which included 10 survey items specifically related to what are considered the 5 core competencies of social emotional learning. And that's shown in the bottom right image of self-awareness, self-management, relationship skills, social awareness, and responsible decision-making. So here's one of the example items on a 4-point Likert scale. I use ways to calm myself down, never, through, a lot of the time. And so now for some results. By having those weather stations installed at each of the parks in those 3 weeks of September and November, we were able to showcase that heat index, which is a combination term for air temperature and relative humidity that captures how it really feels, differed across sites within parks. So here's one of the parks, the same park I showed earlier, and the red area is the hottest spot in the park, which reached about 114 degrees Fahrenheit during September 2019. And that's illustrated in the top right image of an unshaded playground. However, just about 100 feet south of that hottest spot in the park was the coolest spot in the park in September, which reached only about 103 degrees Fahrenheit, which was about 11 degrees cooler. And then here are some results from the cross-sectional study where we looked at the physical sites within each park using SOPARK, that tool for systematic direct observation. And what we found by looking at the use of joint use parks by children both before the pandemic and then comparing it to during the pandemic is that both girls and boys decreased their use of parks outside of school hours, respectively. So this was not us focusing on the school day, but the time outside of the school hours that the park was open to the community. We also saw that most girls and most boys were not social distancing, and the vast majority of the time, children were not wearing face coverings. It was important to understand the specific COVID-19 policies at the time and how that could have influenced what children were conducting in terms of their own behavior. And then by having the children wear those elastic belts with the accelerometer and the GPS device, we were able to show that as temperatures rose, children decreased their physical activity and they sought shade during school recess. What you see here is that at about 91 degrees Fahrenheit, that's the inflection point where children spent more time during recess under shade and less time being physically active. What's also not shown here is that the school park that had the highest amount of tree canopy cover, children spent about 6% more time engaging in physical activity than the park with the least tree canopy. And then kind of our last finding from this project is that we found that children's psychological connection to nature had a significant positive effect on their overall social emotional learning skills, which was just the average across the 10 survey items that focus on social emotional learning. And each of these three competencies, self-awareness, self-management, and relationship skills. So from these results, we are able to recommend quite a few things. First is to change up schoolyard design. We think results provide interest and enthusiasm around greening schoolyards, adding trees and other features, because we did see that it was associated with higher levels of physical activity, and these trees can provide some shading. We recommend shading areas intended for physical activity, such as an activity space as a playground, as we want to make physical activity comfortable and we want to promote it. We also think there's opportunity to add shade to areas that are intended for rest, as we don't expect children and others who are using the park to be physically active 100% of the time. So to have breaks, or for primary caregivers who are watching over youth, it would be a nice space to enjoy the park. So those are some environmental interventions that we recommend. Here are some programmatic interventions specific to schoolyard policy and practice. First is to ensure policies align with need and communicate the policies to the public, as there were potential discrepancies between what the school district was having as COVID-19 policies versus what was happening at the municipal level. And then the communication of those policies to the public is a whole nother story. Second, one could potentially schedule recess during more thermally comfortable times of day. So omitting recess at 2 p.m. or 3 p.m. when the sun's at its hottest, and instead having it earlier could be beneficial to physical activity and the other potential benefits of a green schoolyard. We also recognize that recess is a mental break for students, so we don't expect the schools to potentially put this as the first thing in the morning. Third is there's ability to organize shaded play on extreme heat days. So if it's a hot day and there's still interest in going outside, it would be to have maybe bring a Frisbee to an area of the park that has heavy tree shade, or playing basketball under a canopied basketball court. Then there's this last idea of shifting recess to an indoor space on extreme heat days. We don't think this is an ideal strategy because we already know that individuals spend more than 90% of their days indoor environments, and the opportunity to connect with nature is rather limited indoors. And so getting outside, being able to play may be the way to go here, especially as schools are stressed with their use of space. And so none of this work could take place without our amazing collaborators that worked alongside Melody and me, including the city's Connecting Children in Nature Network, different faculty researchers at University of Texas Health Science Center at Houston and UT Austin, along with some data collectors that are graduate students and City of Austin staff. And so if you have any questions for us, please feel free to just throw them in the chat. I already see the chat's getting full. And also, if you think of something later, please do email us and we'd be happy to answer anything. And then at this point, I think we can share that we can open the floor for such questions. I can't see the chat at this moment, but once I unshare my screen, I can. And then we also, if we don't have or we run out of questions, we have a potential prompt or some kind of activity we can walk the audience through to kind of discuss the idea of green schoolyards and green school parks and what they can mean for health and well-being for the community you live in. So thank you.
Kevin and Melody, we have our first question in the chat, which is, were you able to distinguish shade from trees versus shade from roofs and artificial canopies?
That's a great question. We were able to distinguish shade from trees and artificial structures. But when we did that, I can briefly go back to this slide. So when we showcased the results of the analysis, where we looked at the relations between temperature, shade, and physical activity of children, we didn't make that distinguishment between where the shade came from. We were simply looking at shade in general, because the body of literature has shown that at the end of the day, in terms of thermal comfort, shade is shade. But we could look into further differences between shade from green features versus shade from human-made features. We expect that the green features would have co-benefits to it that would be beyond what could be offered from an artificial structure.
And Anna, I see you put your hand up. Do you have a follow-up to that?
Yeah, totally. And that was my question. And even if anecdotally, it would be incredibly important for us to know if there is a difference, even if it's not statistically significant, because the study design didn't support that. But the effect of evapotranspiration that trees provide as an additional cooling factor makes shade very different. And I do not know if that translates into the way that the children are experiencing that thermal relief. But I would be really interested, even if there is a potential for a follow-up study that incorporates that, as well as the role of water availability, like soil moisture, to allow that vegetation to provide that evapotranspiration cooling that translate into, mitigation of urban heat for the kids. And if that this is amazing, by the way. Just that, wanted to say that, couldn't stay quiet, sorry.
Much appreciated there. What's interesting about the tree, so vegetative strategies for urban heat management, as well as blue spaces as for cooling, those will also raise the relative humidity levels, which ultimately will increase the heat index value, which is just that composite of the air temperature plus relative humidity. Yet that it seems like it's a net positive in the sense that it will still decrease temperatures overall, even if it raises heat relative humidity. So we do think these are welcome strategies, and I think future work should parse out the differences between those different mechanisms, artificial structures versus greening and blue spaces.
I think, Kevin, it's also important to think through, there's a lot of added benefit to trees that children receive, and from the nature perspective. So there could be nests from birds in the canopy. There could be insects crawling along the trunk. The bark could be falling off. So shade is shade from the heat perspective, but in terms of what else can you get from that feature, I think it's also really important to remember those additional factors when considering what those interventions could be if you're looking to mitigate heat or something like that. I would also offer that trees, the ones that we put in at our intervention site, which was Barrington, our first Green School Park, which is where one of these studies takes place. They go in so small, so small. And that shade provided, doesn't come for a decade from actually getting significant shade from that. And so, in the practicality side of it. So like if I'm saying to the Parks Department, like we need more shade, it's going to be both. We need canopy for immediate relief, which is what we're starting to see go in over playgrounds. And we need to add in an entire forest to that space with different species, depending on where they are within that activity space, so that we have shade that extends through the life of that park. And it's not like, 10 years and now the canopy the shade structure needs to be replaced. Well, hopefully by then our canopy has grown up. So, I think that's the combination of both of those, and then looking at the beneficial added benefits to the trees themselves.
You nailed it, Melody. It's really the concert of strategies because they each have their pro and con in terms of maintenance, in terms of upfront costs, in terms of benefits. We know with vegetation, the benefits grow with the vegetation.
Okay, we have another question from Gwendolyn. They ask, what data did the accelerometer give you? Were the kids able to wear it correctly / responsibly?
That's a great question in terms of compliance, and also was it comfortable? Anecdotally, being one of the data collectors on site, along with Melody and a few others, once the children had on the devices, recess kind of took over their mind. And I didn't see many folks, and they were also briefed beforehand at each fitting of putting on these devices before recess with how to wear it, and just do your normal recess and don't think or worry about it kind of thing. Those devices measure physical activity levels. So the intensity of physical activity and the amount of time given in physical activity. And it can be broken down into intensity levels based on these cut points of physical activity intensity that have been identified in the literature. And these cut points are also specific to children in terms of how they move. So you could have light activity, moderate activity, and vigorous activity. We focus on moderate to vigorous physical activity minutes because this is the intensity level of physical activity that's recommended in our national physical activity guidelines for health and well-being.
Okay, I don't see any other questions in the chat. So maybe Kevin, Melody, if you want to pose that prompt that Anna's got another question. I'm going to throw it over to you.
So sorry, but I just thought if you had other than self-reporting levels of emotional or levels of emotional health, or I'm curious if you have considered, maybe not for this study, to measure things like cortisol levels in hair or something that would give you a little bit more of a quantitative approach, because we know some of the weaknesses of self-reporting. I'm just curious if that's something that you've considered.
Of course, that's a great question, Anna. I really appreciate how you're engaging with this work. Both are quantitative approaches, just one is subjective versus objective. And so in terms of self-reported psychological connection to nature and self-reported social emotional learning skills, yeah, there is going to be some response bias in terms of how a child fills out that information. There could be social desirability. That means just, they're how they want to fill it out based on what they want people to read. And I think next studies would do some type of pairing with these different approaches. The only thing about cortisol levels through either saliva swabs or hair collection is those can be either more resource intensive or they could be slightly more invasive. And so that may lead to less engagement with wanting to be in the study, or just lead to discomfort in terms of doing such a thing. But with that said, we do think there is a good reason to do that type of work, and other studies have started to test those opportunities out, especially with children.
Yeah, they're locally, and I know, Anna, you're in Austin. There's a researcher at UT, Jamie Davis, who has done a ton of research around gardens and the impact that those have on school kids. And she has taken blood samples and really looked at some of that measurable physical changes that's happening with some of those engagements. So I'd be happy to share some of her data with you if that's of interest.
Oh yeah, that would be great. Thank you.
I'm also going to plug our webinar next month is with Dr. Debbie Ray, who's with the Link Project out of TCU. And she has been doing studies with hair and cortisol levels. And so she's going to be talking about some of that next month as well. I put the link for next month's webinar in the chat. And then we have a question from Stephanie. They ask, do you have much data for older students? I teach at the high school level, and students talk about wanting to go outside more often, or even just ideas on how to incorporate it at the high school level.
That's a wonderful population to work with, as we know that a lot of behaviors that happen in youth can potentially track into adulthood. And yeah, we think there's unfortunately an inequitable exposure to nature with our youth, and also into adulthood. I personally haven't collected data with adolescents. I've typically worked within the ages of 8 to 11, so like elementary school age children, and have a follow-up study I'm doing now over the summer, looking at summertime physical activity of rising fourth graders. And I'm also looking at air quality alongside air temperature. The interesting thing about high schoolers is, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think they have a recess period available to them. And so I'm interested to understand how physical education requirements, or potentially after school activities, sports teams, and which groups of students are self-selecting or identifying towards this type of engagement with nature.
I would offer two things for high school level. So there's a gal, Claire Latine, who's I think she's out of California. She's somewhere west. She does a lot of work with that age, specific around schoolyard design at the upper levels. So that would be someone I would recommend. And then in terms of, I think specifically in Austin, and this goes back to, like, now that we have these results, like, what do we do with them? Who's going to care? It really speaks to the AISD bond that was passed last year, and all of those infrastructure changes that are about to happen at a number of schools. There are campus architectural teams for each of those sites that are getting complete modernization packages. And that is a great place to plug in to say, like, hey, I am in a middle school, I am in a high school. I want to see outdoor features being used for this, like during the school day, whether that's taking a break, eating lunch outside, actually having activity, taking lessons. It can show up in a lot of ways. It does not have to end at elementary school, which for whatever reason, that's where it does. So should you be in an area that has opportunities to plug in directly to the district and changes that happen at campuses, I think that's a great place to advocate. We have seen personally a lot of change happen from community voicing what they want to see at those sites and having it actually happen when their new site is unveiled. So hopefully there's opportunities. I don't know, Stephanie, if you're in Austin or not, but wherever you might be to plug in that way.
So both Stephanie and Sandra asked to spell Claire's last name. I put it in the chat because actually Claire is our August webinar presenter. And so I put the link for that webinar in our chat as well. And it's Latane is how you spell her last name. Any other questions before we go to the prompt?
Well, the prompt might segue nicely into that last kind of conversation around what about older children or adolescents? And so we just kind of thought of some questions that might be a nice kind of like a kind of thought exercise that we could do with this group. And if you're willing to engage with this, either in the chat or just unmuting and talking, we'd be so happy to hear from you. Or you can just use this as something to think about within your own community. So kind of what we're getting at here is pulling from your work, your experiences, and the experiences of those around you, wherever you find yourself, whether that's Kalamazoo, Michigan, or over here in somewhere in Texas. Can you think of a group or community that would benefit from a Green School Park? We use Green School Park here just to kind of open the floodgates of options in the sense of a green schoolyard that also is open to the community outside of school hours. And so one thing that already came up was those adolescent students, and how could they potentially benefit from a Green School Park? And then second, what issues are the community or that group facing, and how might that Green School Park help alleviate those issues? Third, how would you test whether that Green School Park solves the issue? So that gets kind of that research piece. It doesn't necessarily have to be research only conducted by academics. It could be a joint research initiative that there could be a community science or citizen science approach to it, where school attendees, including staff, could be part of it. And how does it help? That's kind of the evaluation step, this number 3. And then 4, who is in that partnership? What do you consider that school community? Who are the decision makers? Where do these data need to find themselves to actually make evidence for action? And then how would you integrate these teams in these groups together to create a cohesive unit that can express change beyond a project period? So kind of getting at these 4 points here, we're just thinking this is something that we've engaged with our own Green Schoolyards study that we completed. And now we're thinking about that next project to grow and advance what we found in this project. And I think by the questions you guys have given us in this webinar, we've already understood some really interesting takeaways we can move on. And so I invite you all to kind of engage with this and think of any questions you may have. We also have a second kind of exercise we can go through if folks don't have anything off the bat that they want to discuss with this.
And if folks, if you want to take yourselves off mute to answer, please feel free to do so. Oh, we've got Anna, you've got your hand raised. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think in terms of issues for getting more green school parks, at least in Austin, and I'm sure wouldn't be surprised if that's across the board, is one is trained people that can design and implement them. Just at sufficient numbers. There seems to be a bottleneck for that, as well as the maintenance piece, especially when we're talking incorporating green infrastructure. You know, when there's vegetation, how do you make that happen? And that seems to be a barrier for embracing some of these interventions at a level that at the scale at which they would make really a big difference, like you know, all the schools or that kind of thing. So that is an issue that I feel it's a barrier. So if we can move forward with something that helps facilitate getting more people, staff, you know, trained and able to do them, I think that is something that would be of interest.
Thanks so much for sharing that, Anna. That definitely gets at the piece of, so you mentioned maintenance of the design of it, and then who's keeping it moving, who's keeping it available, and how are people aligned with that, and how do we kind of disrupt our current policies to make the resource investment towards maintenance and design an easier ask and an easier lift for the group involved. And I think what you look at with these 4 questions here is that you mentioned number 2, what is the issue it's facing? And it sounds like maintenance and design at the upfront space. And then how that bleeds into these other questions, like who should be involved in the partnership to get at that maintenance and to get at those policy changes. So item number 4.
I'm coming off mute. This is Yasmin. I think other issues that the group and the community are facing are, you know, poverty and hunger, things that are also causing them to not use a green school park. A solution could be growing food on a green school park for the community. So I also think that the stewardship piece cannot be put onto the teachers or the school who are already facing so many different barriers to education. But I do think that there should be incentive to get the students and the teachers outdoors to use the space for learning.
I hear you there, Yasmin, and thank you for sharing that. I think when one understands that just because you have a physical space doesn't mean it's as readily readily easy to access for different community members, just based on place in life, identities, and lack of or constrained resources available to them. And so we have to really shepherd how we can create these magnificent spaces that offer such potential for benefit to the individual in a way that is meeting them where they're at. And that's really starting at step 0 of building relationship with community before you do any type of research process. Because if you're really not designing and identifying these issues alongside community members, you're not truly doing it for them. And so I think a lot of this work has to be slowed down and done with much more intention.
I 100% agree with you, Kevin. And just thinking like through something I have, been brainstorming lately, and like meeting community where they're at in these green spaces and what already takes place at schools to address issues of hunger, like possibly taking the Brighter Bites distribution to the Green School Park versus having it inside the school. Like that is a small step, but could be impactful over time of getting the kids and the families in that space, parents picking up the food, kids naturally playing in that area. I think it could kind of organically happen.
We've got Rosanna's had her hand up for a while. So Rosanna, if you want to take yourself off mute.
Hi, thank you. So I work at an elementary school on the east side, and as we know, there's pretty significant gentrification in that area. And at my particular school, we're really seeing that on campus, where we used to be, 100% free and reduced lunch, African American and Hispanic, and now we're a very split population. And we're seeing problems with these two populations kind of coming together in community. And I'm sure that's being replicated in schools across East Austin and elsewhere. So I'm just curious if there is interest or existing research showing how nature and outdoor spaces can be used to bring kind of two different populations together.
Gosh, that's a big question. I'm just building time to try to answer it. I think I haven't seen that research in terms of nature as that linkage between different populations or different communities, especially when there's naturally, I think, based on what's happening, a kind of conflict that's built in or connotated from the idea of displacement, which may not have reached the minds of the students, but is definitely being felt within that community. I know that there's quite a bit of literature on what we call ecological gentrification or eco-gentrification, where if you green a space that previously wasn't of a high quality green space, then there is a consequence potentially of displacing individuals because you've created an amenity. So it could lead to folks from outside that community coming in and actually moving into that community, and then the property taxes, et cetera, cause folks who it had initially been built for to be lost to that space. So ecological gentrification or eco-gentrification. But there has been one approach by one researcher who mentioned, well, what if you just create it just green enough such that you provide some amenities, but not a dangling carrot that causes new folks to move in and displace those you built it for. I also don't think that's necessarily the answer, because I think everyone should have access to high quality green space and nature. And so we should do so proudly and in a way that protects those individuals to still use those spaces. And that's why it's such a wicked problem, because it's tied to property values. It's tied to so many other aspects of our kind of urban form.
I absolutely love that question, Rosanna. Thank you so much for posing it. Kevin, I'm going to get with you later to see how we might look at that. I also haven't heard any specific research around that question. So I think that's a really interesting idea. I think the one thing that I have seen is nature being used as that like equalizer. Usually you see it in programming. So I don't know if I have seen it in terms of place and like placemaking. So I think that it would be really cool for us to look at that. We work a lot with, in Austin, folks on the east side. I would love to learn a little bit more about your specific site, especially if you're a bond school, and how we might plug into some of that process. But yeah, I would love to look at that a little bit more. And I will just say, I think Linda has had her hand up for a while as well. So I would love to hear it, Linda, if you had a question.
Well, actually, I wanted to go back to the idea of advocacy around green school parks within the new bond. And that seems like a really good strategy, but it would take some kind of education, I think, of the communities to understand. And I'm wondering if there's some sort of easy dog and pony show or something that could be shared with communities. And then kind of related, and it came up in the chat, is the idea that teachers need to know how to use the outdoors and what ways they can use them, you know, for their discipline. And so, you know, teacher education, finding those exemplars and having them share is another area that I think would be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. Two excellent points. Specific to the bond question, I wish I had an easy answer for you. We work very closely with the district, especially around the bond sites. If you have looked at the list of sites that are going to be modernized, you'll see a lot of joint use sites on that list. So the Parks Department has a very large interest in what is happening right now. And those CAT teams that I mentioned are a huge time commitment. They meet, it feels like weekly for probably 6 months. So it is not an easy ask of anyone, let alone someone that's working multiple jobs or, you know, has young children that they have to be home with. And so I think that and we've had some conversations with the district around how can we find ways for community to plug into this process if they don't have that capacity. Because I mean, honestly, like I know I personally don't. I have 2 young children. I would not be able to come to a meeting every week for 6 months, even though I have a huge interest in what's happening at that site. So we're working with the district on that. I have not heard of, they were talking about different ways they were going to try and create opportunities like that. But as of today, I haven't heard that. We do meet with them regularly. So I think, Linda, I do have your contact info. If I find out that they've done something, I will definitely let you know on that front.
I appreciate that.
We are just about out of time. So thank you everyone for participating. There are lots of comments that unfortunately we haven't gotten a chance to answer yet, but I think there's been some pretty good conversation happening in the chat as well. I do ask if y'all have time to please just take a moment to fill out our evaluation of today. And then also our next webinar next month is on July 12th, and it's on unstructured play for positive health benefits in children. And I'm going to put the link to that in the chat as well. And so thank you so much, everyone, and have a fantastic rest of your day.
Thank you.